Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. I'm going to continue our discussion about how technology has impacted political communication, specifically as it applies to the 1960s, late 1960s to the early 1970s. This is important because there were no presidential debates, and during the 1960 era, we already know that there were plenty of political debates and some fascinating advertisements going on. So, as I told you in the 1960 debate, they had to suspend Section 315 of the equal time clause for political candidates. And Congress did that. And they did it again in 1975. I believe it was permanently suspended so that presidential debates could go on without having Congress have to go through the process of suspending a section of the federal code every single time. That's the good news, and that's a policy impact involving technology, but I guess I wouldn't say that's a technological change. Instead, we know that in 1960, the television greatly impacted political communication, not just with the debates, but also with the type of advertising that they were able to do. Now, most people did not own televisions yet, as I explained, but a lot more, a great many of citizens owned a radio or were exposed to a radio in some way, shape, or form. And so they heard political advertisements as well, because of course there were radio ads, newspaper ads that were taken out, articles that were written in support of one candidate or another. And so that part right there, writing about candidates, has not changed. And there was never a requirement that a newspaper or some other written work be part of the equal time clause. That was strictly for telecommunications. So what happened? Well, in 1963, President Kennedy was shot and killed, and Lyndon Johnson took over. And in 1964, which was the next time that we would debate, the candidates on both sides refused to debate. And in 1968, the same thing happened again, and in 1972. And one of the reasons why this may have happened was because there were some technological difficulties. Also, the war was going on, one of the many that we have been involved in. But the presidential candidates did not want to look distracted, like that they couldn't handle the war, that they weren't focused on what was important, either in Congress as their current status or as a governor of a state and so on. So they just simply refused to debate, which was their prerogative. Advertisements did not stop. So I'm going to put up some advertisement examples from this era to show you how the technology grew. But the way that it grew was in sound quality, the use of color, the use of shorter advertisements, because that 3-minute Kennedy advertisement with Johnson, even I barely got through it, right? But as you know, our attention spans have decreased significantly, over even my lifetime, which may sound old, but it's not, I promise. The fact of the matter is that I was born in 1974. So debates started again in 1976. And so I didn't really live in a world without them. I didn't live in a world without the opportunity for a color television. I did not live in a world where we didn't have a telephone, a radio, all of that stuff. I had all of that when I was born. I was born into it. So by the time the mid-1970s came around, the war had ended. I believe it technically ended. I don't know if that's a right word or not, but in 1973, we pulled out. So in 1973, we have less of an international distraction with Vietnam. We have a bigger distraction fighting communism, obviously, from the 40s. The Cold War was continuing. Okay. That did not die down until the 90s, believe it or not completely at least. So through the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot to talk about because we needed a president who was going to be able to handle foreign policy as well as domestic policy. Because as we know, as technology changed, our impact on not just the domestic stage, but the global stage changed greatly. The Kennedy Johnson presidency was probably the first one where we were really able to see the international world stage that our president was on. Nowadays, that's easy to see. Our presidents go overseas, we see the recording, we watch them in real time. We have the technological advances that have shrunk, if you will, the world. And that was predicted to happen, by the way. If you ever read Marshall McLuhan, his theory in media actually predicted that we would end up walking around the globe or wherever we are with a mini television in our hands, was how he put it. And that if we wanted to see an elephant roaming in Africa, we would be able to just pull that up on our phones and see it. And as you all know, we have that. Now, he predicted this long before the technology was available. In fact, I believe that the VCR was invented or was distributed on a mass level just before Marshall McLuhan died. So he had a great deal of foresight in he's the one who actually coined the term a global village. And that's important because the technology during this time wasn't just affecting how political messages got to the citizens of the United States, but it also impacted how policy was communicated to them and how the international world was communicated to citizens. Probably the most interesting or the most important thing to note here was media coverage of the world during Vietnam. The reason that's important is because we here in the United States, and I obviously don't remember this at all, I was a baby, but during the Vietnam War, we had journalists, and they were real journalists, who went over into the Vietnam War, literally embedded. And we still do this sometimes if we have brave journalists who, we've seen some of them die in combat, which is devastating. But the reason they do it is to get us the information that we need. During the war, the first time we had the opportunity to see the real cost of a war. And on television, while people were eating their meals and watching television, this was around the time of the invention of the TV dinner, by the way, people would sit around with the television on and watch literally hundreds of body bags being pulled off of the plane because the soldiers were coming back to the United States to be put to rest. That changed the way people saw war. It changed the way that they thought about combat and international action and policy. It changed everything. Now, some people would tell you that we never again saw that level of violence and blood. It was pretty difficult to watch. And even though it's in black and white, that does not matter, at all. It's still very difficult to watch. And that coverage would be pretty bad if you cut into that footage, that coverage, and had a presidential debate. Here in the United States, nothing's going on. So obviously nobody wanted that. And so some people will say we never again saw that kind of coverage because we learned our lesson. That is not why we never saw it again. We didn't just not see it because it was a political, because it was a political, somehow a political issue. The reason that we never saw the body bags coming back again was because we didn't have a ground war that had those mass casualties. By the time that we did, they had switched from showing body bags coming off of planes to listing the names of soldiers who had died during a battle. And that would be in 1992, roughly. Okay. 1990, 1992, somewhere in there. So what else happened with our changing communication? We were able to choose because we were learning what should be covered and what shouldn't be covered by the media. And that is super helpful. However, at the same time that we were doing that with war, we were not bothering with presidential personal lives, for example, or governor personal lives, and so on. During this time, when we don't have debates and we only have advertisements, we also have scandal after scandal. First, the war, of course. Chappaquiddick, Senator, well, he wasn't the senator at the time. I'm trying to think of what his position was. Ted Kennedy, questionable what happened in the Chappaquiddick River. He was driving over a bridge with his date or girlfriend, I don't remember which, and went over the bridge and she died and he lived, and nobody's really sure what that was all about. So that was one scandal. Another scandal was that this is probably somewhat important. FDR was in a wheelchair. He suffered from polio. But if you look at the coverage of FDR, you would never, ever know that, because the press had enough respect for the office of the presidency to not show him from the waist down or show his chair in any way, shape, or form, or take pictures even of that and share it, because we didn't want to see a president who was injured or weak. We needed a commander-in-chief who was strong and who was able-bodied. But if you didn't know he was in a wheelchair, well, his policies were what mattered, and those were good. But then the press suddenly decided, well, we should show more of the presidency, particularly when John Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy got into the White House. They called it Camelot. They talked about her fashion. They talked about how handsome he was. They talked about the fact that his brother was appointed attorney general. They showed the pretty side of the presidency. Of course, in 1974, we had, I think it was 74. I want to make sure I get this right. When President Nixon, when it was found out that he was recording everything in the White House illegally, or trying to steal the tapes from the White House illegally. And how that worked out. The American people had a press that was digging into what was happening in the White House. I think we were looking for the pretty again. We were looking for that Camelot. We were looking for strength in our president. And what we found was, well, illegal activity from our president. And at that moment, we didn't trust the government anymore. We trusted the media. They became our watchdogs. They were making sure we were okay. Woodward and Bernstein wrote literally a book that destroyed our faith in our government. Not that they wrote the book, but they wrote about what destroyed our faith in the government. And that, of course, was Nixon. Then all of a sudden, the secrets start coming out. Kennedy was sleeping around, possibly with Marilyn Monroe. It's possible Ted Kennedy was actually responsible for the death caused at Chappaquiddick. And I really hate myself because I can't remember her name, the poor victim that died. I used to be able to just roll it off my tongue. We started looking closer into the inside of the White House. And granted, we mostly stayed in the West Wing for good reason. That's our part of the White House. The East Wing is for the family. So the West Wing suddenly became a place we wanted to see into. As technology got better, we didn't need to carry around electrical cords and video cameras on tripods. We didn't have to, we graduated from that. We graduated from a camera that could only see so far or take blurry pictures. We graduated from film to tape, which made a huge difference. Of course, now you guys are like, what the heck is either of those things? And I understand that because everything's digital now. The technology that was needed to find out this information became smaller, it became more compact, and it became more powerful. And so you could walk into a room with a tape recorder or even just a digital recorder that was only this big. Rules and regulations about what we should do about that in regulating communication technologies weren't in place yet. We sort of learned that as we went. And I don't know that we've made all the right decisions. What we do know is that we are glad that we found out what President Nixon was doing in the White House. We are glad to know that piece of information, but just a few, 20 years later, it was less good, I guess I'll say, to find out what President Clinton was doing in the West Wing. There's a part of me that says we have to know. That is important. We have a right to know, and actually we do not. There is no such thing as a right to privacy, and there is no such thing as a right to know. Okay, those don't exist. Check the Constitution. They're not there. But what is here is in the public discourse, the expectation that we can know what's going on in our public offices, be they governors, be they senators, representatives, federal, state, local. We have a right to know, and we word it that way. And the reason we have a right to know is because we elect these officials as representatives. So communication technologies play an important role in regulating what we know and what we aren't allowed to know. Okay, there are things that happen in the White House, in Congress, in the homes of the governors, internationally, things that we do not know and never will. We feel we have the right to know what goes on in the West Wing. We feel that the record of Congress needs to be kept in a way that we know exactly what they're doing at all times. But as you have learned over the past several years, the problem has changed. It's no longer that we don't have the technology to be present or to access what's going on. The problem is that we don't understand what we're seeing. And so instead of we can't get in, we can't take pictures, we can't record, we need Deep Throat to come back and explain to us what's going on. We got done with that. We now have all the access we need. We have all the technology that we could possibly want to find out the information that we want. And now it's not a matter of getting that information. It's a matter of sorting that information and figuring out whether it's true, untrue, a lie, an omission, etc. And that's where we're at. How we got here has to do with that time between the 1960 presidential debate and the 1970. I keep saying 76, but it may have been 72. I'm going to have to double check myself. Because one of the problems with being born in 1974 is that you're unaware. And, you obviously don't know, so you can't remember what you don't know. But I was correct. It was 1976. It was 16 years. What happened in those 16 years? I'll tell you a couple. One, Nixon refused to debate. I want to say it was in 68 and 72. Lyndon Johnson refused to debate in 1964. Now, they will tell you that these are just flat out, we refuse to debate. That meant they had to rely on newspaper cover, all media coverage. They had to rely on advertisements, which, by the way, cost a lot more money than presidential debates. So we start putting more money into not just the presidential elections, but also state and local elections. Okay, this starts to sort of trickle down. And so instead, we realize that, the war, the money, the unwillingness of the candidates to debate, well, that didn't look so good for the candidates that refused to debate. Just so you know, obviously Johnson lost. Nixon managed to win, even though he had refused to debate. How? Well, that's a different question for another class. But in refusing to debate, they absorbed all these other costs, if we should say, that the citizens then have to pay for. We have to do the digging. We rely on the media at this point as our watchdog to find out what it is we need to know. And if a candidate is paying for an advertisement, we should know that. And thus begins this ad is paid for by. All right. Then we get into 1976, and we go back to having presidential debates. Now, the presidential debates, you might be thinking, why is this so damn important? Well, because they impacted communication technology as much as communication technology impacted them. And let me tell you why. Not just because Congress had to suspend the Fair Time, Equal Time Amendment, but also because they had to realize that the people were demanding that they be able to see their presidential candidates, their governor candidates, et cetera, and that the debates were not just the easiest way to reach the greatest number of people and also the least expensive, but the debates had to be negotiated. See, nobody negotiates the advertisements. It's just money. And then your campaign communication manager hopefully is creating good advertisements. Okay. That's how that happens. But during a debate, if you're going to have one, the first thing that needs to occur are negotiations between the candidates. The campaigns get together and they go back and forth and say, well, we want to do it this way. We want to have 3 debates. We want to have 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. That's the way we've always done it in the past. That's the way we should do it. Here's how long it's going to take. Here's the number of people that are going to be involved. Here's the type of questions we're going to ask. One of them is going to be about foreign policy, one about domestic policy, one's going to focus on Russia or economics or oil policy. Take your pick. They could spend hours talking about those things. In those negotiations is where presidents are able to say, I'm just not going to debate, which worked for 16 years. But then people started getting frustrated and saying, well, why doesn't that person want to debate? What is it that you're afraid of if you don't debate? And suddenly the presidential debate became a requirement, almost a requirement to run for office. So those negotiations started to go back and forth. And in 1976, we do have a debate that occurs, and it involves Carter and would it be Carter and Nixon? That doesn't sound right. Wow, I really should have looked this up before. Okay. Nixon, 68 and 72. Okay, so in 76, it was, how hard of a question can this be? Wow, I'm thinking I know what 1980, I know 19, thank God we have the technology to check these things. Look at this. I just typed it into my phone and I have the answer. We got Jimmy Carter. We've got Gerald Ford. Why could I not remember that? That makes sense. The guy who fell off the plane all the time. He had a reputation for being a little bit wobbly on his feet. And and clumsy, and that became sort of one of his more endearing qualities. Anyway, Jimmy Carter runs against Ford. Now, you're probably asking the question, who won? President Carter won. And they decided to debate in the same style and format that President Kennedy and President Nixon decided to debate in. Okay, so we have the same coverage for them in 1976. In 1980 and in 1984 and in 1988, that stays pretty standard. Now, the other thing that starts to happen is the campaigns realize that the presidential debate is pretty formal and presidents need to be on their best behavior. Thus begins negative advertising. Negative advertising was born out of the fact that scandal sells and scandal gets people to vote. And it really wasn't until, I want to say it was 1984, between Mondale, Ferraro, and Reagan. The Democrats put up, I believe it was Senator Mondale at the time, and Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman to run for vice president on a major ticket ever in history. And they put her on there specifically because we knew we were going to lose. I say we, meaning the Democrats knew they were going to lose. The Republicans knew we were going to win. All right. So we knew we were going to win. It was going to be a hands down, easy campaign. And it was. However, what that invited was a great deal of mudslinging. And I just realized I described the 1988 presidential election. How many of you caught that? The 1984 one was actually, I believe, Dukakis. Maybe I have those switched. Wow. Do we care? No. Here's why. In 1984, things just went off the rails as far as negative advertising. Mudslinging, it was considered one of the worst mudslinging campaigns ever. I believe that was Mondale and Ferraro. In 88, I believe it was Dukakis. And the media stopped helping because during one of the debates in 1988, I'm not laughing. It's so absurd. I can't believe it happened. And I'm going to give you a link to the small portion of this debate when this happened, because I sometimes watch it and cannot believe it. But during the 1988 campaign, one of the questioners, it was not Jim Lehrer, one of the questioners in one of the debates sort of tricked Michael Dukakis and ended up asking, if your wife Kitty was raped and assaulted, would you want the death penalty? It was like, what? Talk about an inappropriate question, right? And all of a sudden the negative stuff started bleeding into the presidential debates. And people were really put off by this in 1984 and in 88. They were really put off by this. So the Commission for Presidential Debates gets together and says, what are we going to do in 92? And that's when we changed the format of one of the debates out of the three that presidential candidates did. Why is this important? Well, and in 1992, I graduated high school. So how scary is that? But between 1980 and 1990, technological developments went, as I said, from film to tape. And that made a huge difference in our ability to edit, to double expose, and also easier to mail or send by courier newsreels to and from different stations. And so we also had more cameras. So in the first presidential debates, you see one camera on Kennedy, one camera on Nixon, and that's it for the most part. They might have cut to the panel periodically. By the time we get to the early 90s, there are multiple cameras being used. The camera direction, the director in the back of the newsroom is quickly calling numbers, telling people what camera to focus on. And the technology changed so that the debates could change, which also led to a change in political advertising. So, what happened between 1960 and 1976? One would say a whole lot of nothing, but that's not true. Technological advances in camera quality, moving to color, and in the the attention span of the public, political ads became shorter, more colorful, I guess, more reliant on sort of trick advertising and propaganda, where political campaigns became PR campaigns, sort of in a way, which there's a huge distinction there if you take the political comm class 550, hint, hint. And they also became more easily produced and slightly cheaper to produce. So people were producing more. And all of a sudden we have a political ad constantly. And the American people aren't sure how they feel about that, which brings us, like I said, up to 76 to 80. And so the next little video I'm going to send you is going to be about pretty much 80 to 92. And you're going to see some substantial changes in presidential debates that are based on technological changes. So I'll explain that to you. For now, what's important for you to know is that presidential debates were put on hold. During that time, technological advances, as well as advances in citizen reception of political news, had changed significantly. We saw an increase in negative attacks and in advertising and later on in the debates. And we also saw an increase in our ability to record, film moments with our political leaders that we didn't have access to before. All right. Why is that important? Well, because we're about to get into the fun era of politics, in my opinion. Maybe I'm biased. I was born in 74. The first election I remember was 1980. And that's a vague recollection. Let me just tell you, because I was 6. But there is a recollection there. And by the time we got to 1988, oh my gosh, I was sold. And I was excited to be a part of that. But of course, I couldn't vote until 1992. So I don't know if I'm biased because of that, or it's true that those were the most exciting times in presidential campaigns because of the technological changes. In about 1996, we're going to see another massive technological change with the internet and the World Wide Web. So you have that to look forward to. I'm going to put some links up. I already gave you a discussion board assignment, so I'm not going to give you another one today, but I hope this clarifies some of the timeline of technological advances and its impact specifically on national politics. Our ability to have a discussion with our government, for citizens to have a discussion with our government, is not as great as it is now. It took time to build up to that, and we're going to talk about that next time as well. All right, y'all, I will be in touch.